The hill does not look like the beginning of anything. It rises gently from the dry, gold-brown land of southeastern Anatolia, a rounded swell in a landscape of stony fields, distant mountains, and hard sunlight. For generations, it seems ordinary enough. Just another mound where shepherds pass, where wind moves through grass, where broken limestone lies half hidden in the soil. But beneath that quiet surface, buried under tons of earth and rubble, stand circles of stone older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than writing, older than the first known cities, older even than the world people once thought was capable of building them. The mystery begins not with a palace, not with a king, not with a city wall, but with pillars, tall T-shaped pillars, carved from limestone, set upright in circular spaces, some rising more than 5 meters high. On them are animals, foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, creatures cut into stone with a confidence that feels almost impossible for their age. They are not crude scratches. They are deliberate, symbolic, and strangely alive. They come from a time when, according to the older story of human progress, people should still be moving in small bands across the landscape, following herds, gathering wild plants, living without farming, without pottery, without permanent towns, without the surplus and social machinery supposedly needed for monumental architecture. And yet the stones are there. This is Gobekli Tepe, often described as the oldest known monumental ritual site on Earth. That phrase is careful, because archaeology is careful, and the evidence remains incomplete. But even the careful version is enough to disturb the old sequence. For a long time, the story seemed simple. First came farming, then villages, then temples, then cities, then kingdoms, then writing, then history. Gobekli Tepe stands like a stone obstruction in the middle of that road. It suggests that something else may have happened here, something stranger and more human that belief, ritual, gathering, memory, and shared imagination may have helped pull people together before agriculture fully transformed their lives. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first glance, the site feels almost too early. Its earliest monumental phases are usually placed in the 10th millennium BCE, around 11,000 to 11,500 years ago. This is the end of the last Ice Age world, a time when the climate is shifting, animals are moving, forests and grasslands are changing, and human communities across the Fertile Crescent are beginning to experiment with new ways of living. But at Gobekli Tepe, the stone circles appear before the clear dominance of domesticated grain and herd animals. The builders are not yet city dwellers. They are not subjects of a state. They leave no royal inscriptions explaining themselves. They leave no smith carved in words. They leave stone, bones, tools, fill, fragments, and a silence large enough for centuries of argument. That silence is part of the power of the place. Archaeologists can measure the pillars, study the tool marks, analyze animal bones, date organic material, compare nearby settlements, and reconstruct parts of the world around the site. They can say that wild gazelle, aurochs, boar, sheep, birds, and other animals were consumed there. They can identify flint tools and limestone quarries. They can see repeated building phases, enclosures raised and later filled. But the deepest question remains open. Why did people who had not yet built cities gather here to cut, move, carve, and raise stones of such scale? No single explanation fully accounts for this. Some have called Gobekli Tepe a temple, and the word is useful if it means a place set apart from ordinary life, charged with ritual meaning. But temple also carries images of priests, gods, offerings, and organized religion that may not fit a world before writing and formal states. Others see it as a gathering place, a ceremonial center, a site of feasting, ancestor memory, social alliance, or seasonal congregation. Scholars still debate where daily life ended and ritual began, because in a world this ancient, that boundary may not have existed in a way modern people would recognize. The hill itself deepens the puzzle. Gobekli Tepe is not hidden in a valley or tucked beside a spring. It sits high, with wide views across the Harran Plain and toward distant mountains. From there, the landscape opens like a map of late prehistoric possibility. Wild cereals grow in the region, game animals move through it, stone for tools and building lies close at hand. The place is not random. What survives in the record suggests that people return to it again and again, shaping it, burying parts of it, rebuilding in new forms, leaving behind a layered monument of actions repeated over many generations. That is one of the lesser-known shocks of Gobekli Tepe. It is not just one structure. It is not a single miraculous circle raised in one burst of inspiration. It is a complex mound with multiple enclosures, phases, and buried spaces. Some of its most famous circular buildings belong to an early monumental phase, but later levels show smaller rectangular structures, changes in architecture, shifts in use, and the long life of a place that did not remain frozen in its first form. The site is not a snapshot, it is a slow transformation. The stones themselves seem almost human. Many of the T-shaped pillars appear abstractly anthropomorphic, like bodies reduced to upright forms. Some bear carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloth-like details, suggesting that these are not merely supports for roofs or markers in the ground. They may represent beings, ancestors, spirits, powerful persons, or something for which no modern category is quite right. In the center of some enclosures stand two larger pillars, facing inward or outward with a stillness that feels intentional. Around them, smaller pillars form a ring, as if the architecture creates not just space, but attention. It is tempting to imagine the builders standing there under a night sky untouched by city light, surrounded by animal cries, smoke, bodies, stone dust, and the smell of cooked meat. But archaeology must move carefully between imagination and evidence. There were people here. There was labor here. There was food, carving, planning, and repeated action. Beyond that, the details become uncertain. The evidence can tell us that hands shaped the stone. It cannot fully tell us what those hands believed they were touching. Still, the scale matters. Raising these pillars required coordination. Someone had to quarry the limestone, rough out the forms, move them, carve them, set them upright, and arrange them according to a plan. That does not require kings. It does not require slaves. It does not even require farming villages in the later sense. But it does require shared purpose. It requires a reason strong enough for people to gather and work beyond immediate survival. That reason is the real monument. Gobekli Tepe changes everything, not because it proves a single dramatic theory, but because it makes the old answers too small. It shows that long before empires, long before written law, long before temples of brick and marble, human beings were already building worlds out of symbol and stone. They were already gathering around ideas larger than hunger. They were already leaving marks meant to outlast a season, perhaps even a lifetime. And beneath that quiet hill, the oldest question is not how they lifted the stones, it is what lifted them. Before the stones rise, before the hill becomes a place people return to with labour and intention. The world around Gobekli Tepe is still emerging from the long shadow of ice. Not ice in the immediate sense, because southeastern Anatolia is not buried beneath a glacier, but ice as a planetary condition, a rhythm of cold and dryness that has shaped coastlines, rivers, animal ranges, and human movement for thousands of years. Far to the north, great ice sheets hold enormous quantities of water. Sea levels are lower, winds are harsher, many landscapes are more open, more exposed, and less predictable than they will later become. Human beings live by attention. They read tracks, seasons, plants, weather, animal behavior, stone, fire, and memory. Survival depends not only on strength, but on knowing when the world is about to change. The people who move through this region near the end of the Ice Age are not primitive in the casual sense that word is often used. They are anatomically and mentally modern humans, carrying tens of thousands of years of accumulated skill. Their tools are not random broken stones, but carefully made instruments designed for cutting, scraping, piercing, hunting, processing hides, and working plant material. Their social worlds are not empty. They have kinship, memory, skill, exchange, and belief. They likely know the land in a way that no map can reproduce. What they do not yet have, at least not in the settled agricultural form that later dominates the region, are fields of domesticated wheat, managed herds, pottery traditions, writing, kings, or cities. That absence is exactly what makes the later appearance of Gobekli Tepe so difficult to fit into older assumptions. This is the late Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic world of the Northern Fertile Crescent, a zone that will eventually become one of the great laboratories of human transformation. The phrase Fertile Crescent can make the region sound like a single lush cradle. But the reality is more varied. There are uplands, plains, river valleys, steppe, woodland, limestone ridges, and seasonal patches of abundance separated by harder ground. The world is not permanently generous. It offers pulses. Wild grasses ripen, herds pass through, trees bear fruit, birds migrate, water appears and recedes. Human groups move through these patterns, sometimes widely, sometimes returning to favoured places where resources, memory, and social ties overlap. In the older story of civilization, mobile hunter-gatherers are often imagined as small, simple bands waiting for agriculture to rescue them from uncertainty. Gobekli Tepe belongs to the evidence that complicates that picture. Even before farming, some communities in Southwest Asia are becoming less purely mobile. They return to places season after season. They build houses in some regions. They bury their dead near or beneath living spaces. They gather wild cereals with increasing intensity. They create networks of exchange and ritual. Some Natufian communities farther south, in the Levant, had already built semi-sedentary settlements before full agriculture. The picture is not a sudden leap from wandering to civilization. It is a long, uneven tightening of relationships between people, places, plants, animals, and the dead. Around the time Gobekli Tepe begins to matter, the climate itself is unstable. After the last glacial maximum, warming trends reshape habitats, but the transition is not smooth. The Younger Dryas, a cold and dry climatic reversal beginning around 12,900 years ago and lasting more than a millennium, interrupts the warming world. Its effects vary by region, and scholars still debate exactly how different communities experienced it. But it likely intensifies pressure in parts of Southwest Asia by changing the distribution of plants and animals. When the climate warms again after this interval, landscapes respond quickly. Wild cereals become more available in some areas. Woodland expands. Animal communities shift. People who have already learned to exploit these resources intensively now face new possibilities and new risks. Southeastern Anatolia sits near the upper edge of this changing world. It is close to the natural range of wild einkorn wheat and other cereals that will later become central to agriculture. The region also supports animals that matter deeply to early human communities: gazelle, wild sheep, wild goat, aurochs, boar, fox, birds, and many smaller creatures. These are not just calories. They are movement, danger, prestige, memory, and symbol. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, are huge and formidable. Boars are aggressive. Foxes are clever and elusive. Vultures transform death into disappearance. Snakes emerge from cracks in the earth and vanish into them again. Long before any of these animals are carved into pillars, they already occupy the human mind. The people of this world do not live outside nature as observers. They live inside a web of signs. A broken twig can matter. A change in bird calls can matter. The flowering of a plant, the direction of smoke, the smell of rain on dust, the fatness of an animal at a certain time of year. All of it becomes knowledge. This is one reason the carvings at Gobekli Tepe cannot be reduced to decoration. When hunter-gatherers carve animals, they are not selecting from a picture book. They are drawing from a world in which animals structure time, danger, movement, and perhaps relations with unseen powers. The evidence remains incomplete, but the sophistication of the imagery suggests an already deep symbolic life. A surprising detail is that the builders of Gobekli Tepe may have eaten overwhelmingly wild animals rather than domestic livestock, at least in the early phases excavated so far. The animal bones recovered from the site point strongly toward hunting, with gazelle especially prominent in some assemblages, along with aurochs, wild boar, wild sheep, and birds. This matters because it anchors the monument in a world before the full farming package. These were not peasants bringing sheep from a village pen to a temple courtyard. They were people still deeply engaged with wild landscapes, gathering and hunting at scale, perhaps organizing feasts that drew groups together across wider territories. Food is one of the hidden engines of the story. Monumental building requires bodies, and bodies require calories. Even without domesticated fields, seasonal abundance can produce moments of surplus. Wild grain harvests, mass hunting, nuts, fruits, and meat can support gatherings if planned carefully. The question is not whether hunter-gatherers were capable of complex coordination. Many societies across the world show that they were. The question is why this coordination took such an enduring stone form here, at this moment, in this landscape. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the convergence of climate change, resource richness, symbolic tradition, and social gathering makes southeastern Anatolia unusually fertile ground for transformation. The world before Gobekli Tepe is therefore not empty waiting space. It is crowded with knowledge. It contains people who remember roots, seasonal camps, burial places, dangerous animals, useful plants, flint sources, water holes, and stories attached to hills. It contains communities negotiating who belongs, who marries whom, who shares food, who leads a hunt, who remembers the dead, and who can speak for powers not visible in daylight. This site will later look astonishing because of its stones, but the stones are only the visible residue of a much larger human world. By the time people begin shaping the limestone under that Anatolian sky, they are not inventing meaning from nothing. They are concentrating it. They are taking relationships that already exist across the land and giving them a fixed place. The hill becomes important because the world around it is changing, and because human beings, facing change, often answer with gathering, memory, and form. Long before the first city rises, the conditions for something city-like in spirit are already present. Repeated return, shared labour, symbolic authority, and the uneasy feeling that a place can hold more than shelter. It can hold a world. The land around Gobekli Tepe is not a paradise, but it is alive with opportunity in a way that matters. To understand why people gather here, it is not enough to imagine a lonely hill with mysterious stones under a wide sky. The hill belongs to a region where the end of the Ice Age changes the rules of existence. Rainfall patterns shift, temperatures rise, plants move into new ranges, herds adjust their routes. Valleys and uplands begin to offer richer seasonal combinations than they once did. The world is still uncertain, still capable of hunger and hardship, but it is also becoming more productive in particular places, and the people who know those places best are positioned to notice every change. Southeastern Anatolia lies near the Great Arc where wild cereals grow naturally. Einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley, and related grasses do not yet belong to human fields in the later agricultural sense, but they are already deeply useful. Their seeds can be harvested, stored, ground, cooked, and shared. They ripen according to seasonal rhythms that careful communities can anticipate. A stand of wild grain is not a farm, but it is also not random abundance. It invites return. It rewards memory. It encourages people to come back at the right time, with the right tools, in sufficient numbers, and perhaps with expectations that go beyond food alone. The difference may sound small, but it is one of the quiet turning points in human history. A mobile group that returns again and again to a rich harvest zone begins to relate to the land differently. Paths become familiar, camps become remembered, burial places may become anchors, stories attach themselves to ridges, springs, groves, and animal crossings. What survives in the record suggests that across parts of Southwest Asia, these repeated returns gradually become more intensive, more structured, and in some places more settled. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single region explains everything. But Gobekli Tepe stands inside this wider transformation, from movement alone toward movement organized around powerful places. Wild grain is only part of the attraction. The animal world around the site is equally important. Gazelle move in herds across open ground, offering meat, hides, bone, sinew, and social prestige to those who hunt them effectively. Wild boar route through woodland and brush. Aurochs, massive wild cattle, command attention by sheer force of body. Wild sheep and goats occupy rougher terrain. Birds gather, migrate, scavenge, and signal seasonal change. Foxes pass between human camps and wilder edges. Neither fully threatening nor fully harmless, snakes appear from stone and earth, creatures of sudden motion and hidden places. This is a landscape where animals are not background. They are the moving grammar of the world. At Gobekli Tepe, that grammar later becomes visible in stone. But before the carvings, there is lived experience. A hunter who has faced an aurochs does not see it as an abstract species. A gatherer who has watched vultures descend does not think of them as mere birds. A child who learns which snakes are dangerous, which tracks belong to foxes, which season brings gazelle close, is learning a world full of meanings. The carvings may not be simple records of diet, because the animals most often eaten and the animals most prominently carved do not always match in any straightforward way. Scholars still debate the relationship between the bones in the fill and the creatures on the pillars. That mismatch is one of the strange clues. Some animals may represent fear, power, death, group identity, seasonal cycles, or stories now lost. The hill's position also matters. Gobekli Tepe rises above the surrounding plain, with views extending across a broad and changing landscape. It is not beside a major river in the way later cities often are. It does not look like the most convenient place for ordinary settlement. This has helped support the idea that its importance is not primarily domestic. People may come here not because it is the easiest place to live, but because it is the right place to gather. Height gives visibility. Visibility gives memory. A hill seen from a distance can become a marker in both geography and imagination. In a world without written maps, such places carry orientation in the body. There is also stone. The limestone bedrock near the site provides the material from which the pillars are cut. Some unfinished pillars found in quarry areas show that the builders work directly from the living rock, shaping forms before detaching them. This is not a minor convenience. Monumental architecture depends on material possibility, a landscape with workable stone, skilled flint users, and people accustomed to reading rock surfaces gives the builders the means to turn symbolic intention into physical fact. The tools are not metal, not bronze or iron, but stone tools can shape limestone with patience and technique. The achievement is not magic. It is labour guided by knowledge. One lesser-known detail is that the mound itself, before excavation, was partly recognised by local people as a place of unusual stones. Farmers encountered carved fragments and large limestone pieces while working the land, and some stones were moved or reused before archaeologists fully understood the site. This reminds us that ancient places rarely sleep completely untouched. They pass through the hands of later communities who may not know their age, yet still notice their strangeness. The modern discovery feels sudden, but the hill had a long afterlife as part of a living rural landscape. The broader environmental story remains debated in its details. Climate change did not simply force people to invent agriculture, and it did not automatically produce temples. Human choices matter, social relationships matter, belief matters. Many places experience changing climates without producing anything like Gobekli Tepe. Still, the timing is difficult to ignore. As the post-Ice Age world becomes warmer and more varied, certain regions offer denser resources, and denser resources make larger gatherings more feasible. Larger gatherings create new problems: how to share food, manage conflict, arrange marriages, honor the dead, maintain alliances, and decide who has authority when groups come together. Ritual may not be separate from those problems. It may be one of the ways people solve them. A feast, for example, is never only eating. It is obligation, display, generosity, competition, memory, and alliance. The large quantities of animal bone found at Gobekli Tepe have encouraged interpretations involving communal consumption. If people gather there seasonally, perhaps after hunts or harvests, the work of carving and building may be bound to the work of feeding and being fed. To raise a pillar could be to participate in a shared act that confirms belonging. To attend a ceremony could be to renew ties across distance. To consume meat in such a place could mean more than survival. It could mean entry into a remembered order. Yet caution is necessary. The site does not give up its meaning easily. Archaeologists can identify tools, architecture, bones, and residues, but the thoughts that connected them remain partly beyond reach. No single explanation fully accounts for why this hill, among many possible hills, became so important. The safest answer is not the weakest one, Gobekli Tepe likely emerged from a convergence. The land was rich enough to support gatherings. The stone was available. The people had symbolic traditions already deep and complex. The climate was changing. Social worlds were expanding. And somewhere in that convergence, a hill became more than a hill. This is how a landscape wakes up in human history, not all at once, not by command, not because a king orders it, but because repeated attention changes a place. A ridge becomes familiar, a quarry becomes useful, a view becomes memorable, a seasonal gathering becomes expected, a carving becomes necessary, a circle of stones becomes the center of something no one writes down, but many people understand. By the time the first great pillars stand upright, the land has already been prepared by weather, plants, animals, stone, and generations of human return. The monument is not imposed on the landscape, it grows out of it, as if the hill has been waiting for people to discover that it can hold their fears, their feasts, their dead, and their beginning. For most of its modern life, Gobekli Tepe is not famous. It does not announce itself as a revolution in human history. It sits quietly beneath a rounded mound, its buried architecture hidden so completely that the surface gives only hints. The land is worked. Stones appear in the fields. Some are noticed, some are moved, some are broken, some are dismissed as inconvenient fragments from a rocky hill. There is no obvious ruined city, no standing colonnade, no inscription waiting to be read. The site's first modern disguise is its simplicity. It looks like a place where nothing very dramatic has happened. That is often how the deepest past survives, not as a clean monument standing in open air, but as a confusion of earth, stone, rumour, and misidentification. In the 1960s, a survey connected to research in southeastern Turkey recorded the hill, but the significance of what lay beneath was not understood. The fragments visible on the surface seemed, at the time, to belong to a much later period. Some were interpreted as possible Byzantine cemetery remains, and the site did not immediately attract the kind of attention that would change archaeology. This early misunderstanding is one of the strange accidents in the story. A place capable of rewriting the early Neolithic was seen, noted, and effectively passed over. There is no shame in that. Exactly. Archaeology depends on what is visible, on expectations shaped by existing knowledge, and on the limits of a moment. In the 1960s, the idea that a pre-agricultural or very early Neolithic community could have raised massive carved limestone pillars was not part of the normal interpretive landscape. If one expects monumental stone architecture to belong to later settled societies, then the mind tries to fit unusual stones into a later category. The hill was not just physically buried, it was buried beneath assumptions. Decades later, that changes. In the 1990s, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visits the mound and sees it differently. He has experience with early Neolithic sites in the region, and the stones do not look to him like ordinary grave markers from a late cemetery. The limestone fragments, the flint, the shape of the mound, the carved pieces, all of it begins to suggest something far older and stranger. Excavations begin in 1995 and almost immediately the ground starts to undo the old story. Beneath the soil are not scattered remnants of a modest later site, but monumental enclosures built with enormous T-shaped pillars, some carved with animals in relief. The moment is difficult to overstate, though it should not be romanticized into a single flash of revelation. Archaeological understanding grows through careful digging, recording, comparing, dating, doubting, and revising. Still, There are discoveries that alter the scale of the possible. Gobekli Tepe is one of them, as the excavations reveal circular and oval structures, central pillars, surrounding rings of stones, benches, walls, carved reliefs, and dense fill. The site begins to look like something no one had quite expected from this time and place. It is not simply old, it is organized, repeated, monumental, and symbolic. The early investigators face a double challenge. They must excavate the site physically, but they must also excavate it intellectually from the categories that do not fit. Is it a settlement? The evidence for ordinary domestic life is limited in the best-known monumental areas. Is it a cemetery? Human remains are not present in the way one would expect from a straightforward burial ground, though later studies raise complex questions about skull fragments and mortuary practices. Is it a temple? That word captures the sense of special use, but it may import later religious assumptions. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the language that should be used. Yet the site's difference is obvious from the beginning. One lesser-known detail is how much of Gobekli Tepe remains unexcavated. The famous enclosures represent only a portion of the mound. Ground-penetrating surveys and the visible shape of the hill suggest many more buried features, but excavation is slow by necessity. Every layer removed is also a layer destroyed unless recorded with great care. Conservation matters. Exposure changes stone, weather, tourism, and even the act of revealing the past can threaten what survived safely underground for millennia. The site the public imagines is therefore both spectacular and partial. The known Gobekli Tepe is only a window cut into a much larger buried world. As the pillars emerge, their age becomes the most unsettling fact. Radiocarbon dating of organic material associated with the fill and structures places the earliest monumental phases in the pre-pottery Neolithic, roughly the 10th millennium BCE. This means the people who made the oldest enclosures lived before pottery was widely used in the region, and before the settled farming villages of later Neolithic life had fully taken shape. They lived in a world at the threshold of agriculture. Not comfortably after it, the old ladder of progress begins to wobble. The discovery also comes at a time when archaeologists are already rethinking the Neolithic. Gobekli Tepe does not appear from nowhere as the only sign of complexity before farming. Other sites across Southwest Asia have shown that early communities were experimenting with architecture, symbolism, burial practices, and new relationships to plants and animals. But Gobekli Tepe gives this transformation a dramatic stone body. It makes the argument impossible to ignore. Here, carved into a hilltop, is evidence that large-scale communal construction and symbolic architecture can appear before the full package of agricultural civilization. The site also exposes the danger of expecting the past to follow modern common sense. It seems practical to assume that people build big things only after they have food surplus, permanent villages, hierarchy, and administrators. But human beings are not practical in that narrow way. They will cross distances for ritual. They will fast, feast, dance, mourn, compete, and labour for the invisible. They will move heavy objects because the objects matter. They will build places that do not directly feed them, because those places feed something else: identity, memory, alliance, fear, authority, hope. Gobekli Tepe does not prove that religion created civilization in some simple formula, but it shows that symbolic life is not a luxury added after survival. It can be part of how survival is organized. As excavation continues, the first strange discovery becomes many discoveries. Pillars are found with arms and hands carved along their sides, implying human-like forms. Animals appear in combinations that resist easy decoding. Some enclosures are filled in with rubble containing bones, flint tools, and debris. Later buildings differ from earlier ones. The site has a biography. It is born, used, changed, buried, reused, transformed, and eventually abandoned. The more archaeologists uncover, the less it resembles a single answer. Modern fame brings another layer. Gobekli Tepe becomes a magnet for documentaries, tourists, popular books, and speculative theories. Some of that attention helps protect and fund research. Some of it distorts the evidence. Claims about lost super civilizations, ancient astronauts, or impossible technology attach themselves to the site because mystery invites exaggeration. But the real Gobekli Tepe does not need those additions. Its confirmed facts are already extraordinary. Stone Age communities, without metal tools, without wheels, without writing, and without known state organization, created a monumental ritual landscape at the dawn of the Neolithic. That is enough. The rediscovery of Gobekli Tepe is therefore not just the story of archaeologists finding stones. It is the story of a modern world being forced to look again at people it had underestimated. The builders were not waiting at the edge of civilization for farming to make them interesting. They were already capable of planning, symbolism, cooperation, and ambition. The mound hid their work for nearly 12,000 years, and when it finally opened, it did not offer a simple message. It offered a correction. What looked like an ordinary hill was a sealed argument with history, and once the first pillars came into view, the argument could no longer be ignored. The pillars are the reason the hill becomes impossible to dismiss. They do not merely sit in the ground like rough stones raised for a boundary or a grave. They stand with form, proportion, and intention. Many are shaped like a capital T, with a long vertical body and a broad headpiece crossing the top, their surfaces smoothed and sometimes carved in relief. Some are modest in size, but others are enormous, rising higher than a person, heavier than anything that should comfortably belong to a world without metal tools, draft animals, or wheeled transport. In the oldest and most famous enclosures, two large central pillars dominate the space, surrounded by smaller pillars set into walls, creating a circle of attention that feels planned from the beginning. Their age is the first shock. The earliest monumental phases at Gobekli Tepe belong roughly to the 10th millennium BCE, around the dawn of the Neolithic in this region. That means these stones were raised thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge, before the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, before the first cities of Sumer, before written names, before kings could declare themselves eternal. The phrase older than civilization can be misleading if it implies the builders were uncivilized, but it captures the problem. Gobekli Tepe stands before the familiar markers by which civilization is usually recognized. It is monumental before monarchy. It is symbolic before writing. It is architecturally ambitious before the urban world. The construction itself begins in the limestone. Nearby bedrock provides the raw material, and unfinished pillars still attached to quarry surfaces show something of the process. The builders cut channels around a pillar shape, isolate it from the surrounding rock, shape it with stone tools, and eventually detach it. This work requires skill and patience more than impossible technology. Flint tools can cut and peck limestone. Hammerstones can bruise and shape it. Abrasion can smooth surfaces. The difficulty lies not in magic, but in organization. A single pillar may weigh several tons. It must be extracted without breaking, moved across uneven ground, positioned upright, and integrated into a structure whose layout has already been imagined. The enclosures themselves are not random heaps of stone. In several early examples, the walls form circular or oval spaces, sometimes with stone benches running along the interior. The surrounding pillars are set into these walls, while the two central pillars occupy the middle like presences rather than supports. Whether the structures had roofs remains debated. Some scholars have argued for open-air spaces, while others suggest that at least some buildings may have been roofed or partially roofed. The evidence remains incomplete, and architecture this old rarely preserves all the clues needed for certainty. But whatever their exact covering, these spaces shape human movement. They create an inside and an outside. They separate ordinary ground from charged ground. Then there are the carvings. A fox appears stretched along a pillar's surface. Snakes ripple downward or cluster in restless forms. A boar bristles with energy. Birds stand stiffly, some possibly cranes or vultures. Scorpions, spiders, insects, wild cattle, gazelle, and other creatures enter the stone world. These images are not evenly distributed as decoration. They seem chosen, placed, and repeated with purpose. Some pillars are crowded with figures, others are nearly plain. Some animals appear threatening, others seem watchful or symbolic in ways that no modern viewer can fully recover. Scholars still debate whether the carvings represent clans, myths, dangers, spirits, seasonal signs, or something stranger than any single category. One of the most striking details is that many T-shaped pillars appear to be stylized human bodies. On some, arms run down the sides, hands curve toward the front, and belts or loincloth-like elements mark the lower body. Yet there are no carved faces on the broad heads. The effect is uncanny. These are human-like beings without eyes, without mouths, without individual expression. They may represent ancestors, supernatural figures, ritual participants, or abstracted persons. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the combination of human form and animal imagery suggests a symbolic system far richer than simple ornament. The central pillars in some enclosures are especially powerful. They are taller, more carefully placed, and sometimes more elaborately marked. They stand in pairs, giving the impression of two great beings occupying the heart of the space. Around them, the other pillars may form an audience, a boundary, or a community of stone presences. It is tempting to see a gathering reproduced in architecture: central figures, surrounding figures, animals crossing between worlds. But caution is necessary. Archaeology can identify pattern. It cannot easily translate meaning. What survives in the record suggests intention, not the dictionary of that intention. The people who carved these stones lived before writing, but not before art. That distinction matters. Symbolic expression is far older than Gobekli Tepe. Painted caves, engraved bones, personal ornaments, figurines, burials, and body decoration all show that humans had long been creating meaning through image and object. Gobekli Tepe does not mark the birth of symbolism. Instead, it marks something different: symbolism made architectural, communal, and monumental. The images are no longer only carried, worn, painted in hidden caves, or placed with the dead. They are built into a public stone setting, fixed in a place where groups can gather around them. The age of the pillars also means that they belong to a world without pottery, at least in the earliest levels. This is why archaeologists place the site within the pre-pottery Neolithic. It is a strange phrase for such a dramatic landscape, defining the period by something absent, but the absence is useful. It reminds us that the builders do not yet live in the later Neolithic world of widespread ceramic containers, established village farming, and fully domesticated herds. Their technology is different, their food systems are different, their settlements are different, yet their capacity for collective imagination is unmistakable. A lesser-known feature of the site is how much labour went not only into building the enclosures, but into filling them. Some of the famous circular structures were deliberately packed with debris stone rubble, flint artifacts, animal bones, and other material. This fill helped preserve the pillars, but it also complicates interpretation. Were the enclosures ritually closed? Were they buried as part of rebuilding? Were materials from feasts, workshops, and other activities gathered into the spaces after their use ended? The evidence remains incomplete. But the burial of the monuments suggests that their lives had endings as meaningful as their beginnings. The pillars force a change in scale. Before Gobekli Tepe, many people imagined early hunter-gatherer or transitional communities mainly through small tools and scattered camps. Here, the evidence is vertical. It towers. It shows that people without cities could still create places that required planning beyond a household, beyond a single family, perhaps beyond a single band. This does not mean they had kings in the later sense. It does not mean they had a priesthood like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Those claims would go beyond the evidence. But it does mean they had ways to persuade, coordinate, inspire, or obligate people to work together. That may be the most important thing the pillars say. Their mystery is not only technical. Moving stone is difficult, but humans have always solved difficult tasks when enough meaning gathers around them. The deeper mystery is social. How did people agree that this work mattered? Who chose the animals? Who knew the plan of the circle before it existed? Who remembered the right way to raise a pillar? Who decided when a structure was finished, when it was used, and when it should be buried? These questions remain open, but they lead toward the same unsettling conclusion: complex human organization did not begin only when grain was domesticated and walls enclosed towns. It was already forming in ritual, memory, and shared labor. Standing among the pillars today, even through photographs or reconstructed plans, it is easy to feel the distance between evidence and meaning. The stones are specific, measurable, real. Their world is gone, yet they do not feel mute. They say that the beginning of monumental architecture was not necessarily a practical response to administration, storage, or defense. It may have begun with something harder to measure: the need to gather around forces that made human life feel ordered in a changing world. The oldest temple on Earth, if that is what Gobekli Tepe was, does not change history by giving us a complete answer. It changes history by proving that the question is older than we thought. The builders of Gobekli Tepe are the most difficult part of the monument to see. The stones survive, the walls survive, the carvings survive in damaged but astonishing form. Bones, flint, rubble, and traces of construction survive. But the people themselves appear only indirectly, through choices pressed into limestone and debris. They do not leave names. They do not leave written commands. They do not show us a king pointing toward a quarry or a priest recording offerings. They stand behind the evidence like figures behind a curtain, and yet everything at the site depends on them. The central mystery is not simply that they could build. Human beings have been skilled makers for a very long time. The mystery is that they chose to build at this scale before the usual social machinery of later civilization seems to exist. No palace oversees the work. No city surrounds the hill. No clear administrative system keeps accounts of labor and food. No domesticated oxen drag the pillars. No bronze tools cut the stone. The people who raise these enclosures appear to belong to a world still strongly rooted in hunting and gathering, even if that world is already changing. This forces a more interesting question than whether they were capable. It asks what kind of society can organize monumental labor without becoming a state. The answer may begin with gathering. Gobekli Tepe likely does not represent a single isolated band acting alone. The amount of work, the scale of the feasting evidence, and the symbolic richness suggest a place where groups may have come together from a broader region. Seasonal gatherings are common in many mobile or semi-mobile societies. They allow people to exchange goods, arrange partnerships, share information, resolve tensions, perform rituals, and renew identity. In ordinary seasons, smaller groups may spread across the landscape. At important times, they converge. The hill becomes a social engine, drawing scattered communities into a shared centre. Such gatherings do not require farming in the later sense. They require timing, trust, and food. Wild resources can support large events if people know when to gather and how to prepare. Gazelle migrations, wild grain harvests, nut seasons, and other ecological rhythms can create windows of abundance. People may hunt intensively, process meat, gather plants, brew, or prepare special foods, and distribute them in ways that build obligation. Scholars still debate whether feasting was central to Gobekli Tepe's function, but the large quantities of animal bone and the absence of ordinary domestic settlement in the monumental area make communal consumption a serious possibility. Food at such a place is never just food. A person who provides meat gains status. A group that sponsors a gathering earns influence. A successful hunt becomes a public memory. A shared meal can settle alliances more effectively than a spoken agreement. The work of building may be tied to the work of feeding. Those who come to carve, haul, and raise stone may also come to eat, witness, mourn, celebrate, and be seen. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. But labour and ceremony are likely not separate categories here. The act of construction may itself have been ritual. The practical challenges are considerable. First, someone must know where suitable stone lies. Then the pillar must be planned in the bedrock, cut out with stone tools, shaped and detached. Workers must coordinate effort without modern machines, using ropes, levers, wooden sledges, rollers, ramps, or methods that leave little trace. The pillar must be moved without shattering. The socket or setting must be prepared. The upright stone must be raised safely. A moment of danger as well as accomplishment. After that, carving may continue. Walls may be built around it, benches shaped, surfaces finished, and the space maintained. None of this demands a tyrant. It does demand leadership of some kind. Leadership may have been temporary, situational, ritual, or based on knowledge rather than inherited office. The best hunter, the most respected elder, the keeper of stories, the specialist in stone, the person believed to understand dangerous powers. Any of these could hold authority in particular contexts. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be misleading to project later priesthoods backward onto the 10th millennium BCE. But it is equally misleading to imagine a flat, structureless society. Cooperation at this scale usually has organizers, even when those organizers do not become kings. One lesser-known clue comes from the skill visible in the carvings. The reliefs are not all identical in quality, but some show remarkable control. This suggests craft knowledge passed between people, perhaps specialists who had practiced carving enough to develop recognizable techniques. Specialization does not have to mean full-time professional classes. In small-scale societies, a person can be a hunter, ritual expert, and skilled craft worker at different times of year. Still, Gobekli Tepe hints at people whose abilities were valued because they could turn stone into meaning. the question of where the builders lived remains complicated. For a long time, Gobekli Tepe was often described as a ritual site without settlement, a sanctuary used by mobile hunter-gatherers. More recent work in the broader region and continuing reassessment of the site itself has made the picture more nuanced. There may have been domestic activities nearby or within later phases, and nearby settlements show that the line between ritual and daily life is not always clean. Scholars still debate the degree of permanent occupation at Gobekli Tepe. What is clear is that the most famous early enclosures are not ordinary houses. Their form, scale, and imagery set them apart. This uncertainty is important because it protects the site from becoming too simple. If the builders were entirely nomadic visitors, the monument becomes one kind of mystery. If they were semi-sedentary communities with nearby habitation, it becomes another. If the site shifted over time from special gathering place to more mixed settlement activity, that may be closer to the truth. Ancient places are rarely one thing forever. A hill can begin as a ritual focus, become a place of repeated residence, be modified, buried, remembered, and reinterpreted by later people. What survives in the record suggests change, not a frozen institution. The builders also live at a threshold in the relationship between humans and food. They are not yet farmers in the full later sense, but they may already be influencing plant and animal populations through repeated harvesting, hunting strategies, and landscape use. Intensive collection of wild cereals can favor certain traits over time. Keeping people fed during gatherings may encourage more reliable food production. The need to host, impress, and sustain large groups could push communities toward cultivation. This is one of the most provocative possibilities raised by Gobekli Tepe, that ritual demand may have helped intensify the search for dependable food. That does not mean religion invented farming in a simple, dramatic stroke. Agriculture emerges over long periods in multiple places through many pressures: climate, demography, ecology, experimentation, risk management, social competition, and cultural choice. But Gobekli Tepe makes it harder to treat farming as the sole cause of complex society. The builders seem to have complex social and symbolic lives before agriculture fully dominates. Perhaps the desire to gather created new food pressures. Perhaps feasts encouraged larger harvests. Perhaps special places made people return often enough to begin managing the plants around them more carefully. The evidence remains incomplete, but the direction of influence may not have been one way. The absence of a city also changes how the monument feels. Later temples are often embedded in urban systems, supported by taxation, craft production, political power, and institutional religion. Gobekli Tepe belongs to a more fluid world. Its authority may have depended on participation. People came because the place mattered, because others came, because ancestors or powers were thought to be present, because alliances needed renewal, because the season called them, because not coming had consequences. In such a world, architecture does not enforce power by walls alone. It gathers power by repetition. The builders without a city may therefore reveal something fundamental about human beings. Cities are not the first proof that humans can imagine beyond the household. Long before streets and markets, people can organize around a shared invisible center. They can create obligations that reach across distance. They can work for the dead, for animals, for spirits, for memory, for prestige, for fear, for beauty, for reasons mixed together so tightly that modern categories fail. Gobekli Tepe is astonishing because it shows this capacity in stone at a very early date. The hill does not need a lost empire beneath it. It does not need vanished technology or forgotten visitors from elsewhere. Its builders are enough. They're more interesting than any fantasy because they belong to the real human past, to communities standing at the edge of a new age without knowing what later centuries would call it. They lift stones before cities because something in their world already has the force that cities will later harness: collective belief, social pressure, and the ability to make a place matter so much that people shape their lives around it. The animals at Gobekli Tepe do not behave like decoration. They do not simply fill empty stone. They gather on the pillars with a pressure that feels older than language, as if the builders are not trying to make the structures beautiful in any ordinary sense, but charged. A fox stretches across limestone with its narrow body and alert presence. Snakes descend in clusters, sometimes so many that they seem less like individual creatures than a force. Boars appear with bristling intensity. Birds stand with long legs and sharp profiles. A scorpion waits with its tail raised. Elsewhere there are wild cattle, gazelle, insects, spiders, and other forms, each cut by hands that know these bodies not from imagination alone, but from living beside them. This is one of the reasons Gobekli Tepe feels so close and so unreachable at the same time. The animals are recognizable. A modern viewer can identify a snake, a fox, a boar, a bird, but recognition is not understanding. To see the shape is not to know the story. These carvings belong to a symbolic world without writing, without captions, without later myths preserved in text that can be compared line by line. The evidence remains incomplete. And scholars still debate whether the animals represent clans, seasonal signs, dangerous powers, protective beings, mythic episodes, death rituals, or something that does not fit any modern category neatly. The first caution is that the animals carved in stone are not simply a menu. Animal bones recovered from the site show extensive hunting and consumption, with gazelle prominent in some deposits, along with wild cattle, boar, wild sheep, birds, and other species. But the most frequently eaten animals are not always the most prominent in the imagery. This gap matters. People do carve animals they hunt, of course, but symbolic importance is not measured only by calories. A rarely eaten creature may dominate the imagination because it is dangerous, elusive, nocturnal, poisonous, connected with death, or associated with a particular place or group. A vulture may not feed the living in the same way a gazelle does, but it can transform a corpse into bones and absence. That kind of power is hard to ignore. Snakes are among the most arresting figures. They appear again and again, sometimes arranged vertically, sometimes grouped in patterns that create a sense of motion. In many human cultures, snakes occupy symbolic territory between life and death, surface and underworld, danger and renewal, because they shed their skins, vanish into holes, strike without warning, and move without limbs. It would be careless to impose later meanings directly onto Gobekli Tepe, but the animal itself invites attention. A snake in a landscape of limestone cracks and dry earth is not an abstract sign. It is a sudden encounter. It comes from below, or seems to. It disappears into the same ground from which pillars are quarried and into which the dead may be placed. Foxes are equally intriguing. They appear with a frequency that has puzzled researchers. Foxes are not the largest animals, nor necessarily the most economically important, yet they hold a strong place in the carved world of Gobekli Tepe and related early Neolithic sites. They are liminal creatures, living near human spaces without belonging to them, scavenging, hunting, watching, slipping between open land and settlement edge. Their skins, tails, or behavior may have carried meanings now lost. Some human burials from early Neolithic contexts elsewhere in the region include fox-related elements, suggesting that the animal had symbolic weight beyond this one hill. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the fox seems to belong to the borderlands of the human imagination. Boars bring another kind of energy. In the wild, they are dangerous, muscular, and unpredictable, capable of injuring hunters and dogs. A carved boar is not a passive image. It carries the memory of noise, tusk, mud, blood, and risk. Wild cattle, when they appear, carry even greater force. The aurochs is not the manageable domestic cow of later villages, but a huge animal, aggressive when threatened, impressive in body and horn. To hunt one is to confront power directly. To carve one is perhaps to fix that power within the ritual space. What survives in the record suggests that the animal world surrounding Gobekli Tepe is not merely observed, but engaged as a realm of agencies. Birds complicate the picture further. Some long-legged birds may be cranes or similar species, while other images have been interpreted as vultures. Vultures are especially important because they appear in mortuary symbolism across parts of Neolithic Anatolia and the Near East. At later Çatalhöyük, for example, vultures appear in painted scenes associated by some scholars with death and excarnation, though interpretations remain debated. At Gobekli Tepe, vultures may suggest a concern with the transformation of bodies after death. A bird that consumes flesh and leaves bone clean is a disturbing and practical participant in the cycle of disappearance. It turns the human body into something else. This possibility connects to a wider pattern of early Neolithic mortuary practices. In several sites across the region, human skulls are treated in special ways. Some are removed, curated, modified, plastered, or displayed. At Gobekli Tepe itself, fragments of human skulls with cut marks and modifications have been studied as possible evidence for special skull treatment. The relationship between these remains and the animal carvings is not certain, but the presence of vultures, headless human imagery on some nearby or related iconography, and skull practices in the broader Neolithic world all suggest that death is close to the symbolic centre. Scholars still debate the details, but the site's animals may belong to a world where the boundary between living bodies, dead bodies, and powerful non-human beings is deeply active. One of the most famous carved compositions is often discussed because of its density and strangeness. A pillar bearing multiple animals, including a scorpion and birds, arranged in a way that has invited many interpretations. Some popular theories have tried to read such scenes as star maps, comet records, or encoded accounts of cosmic disaster. These claims attract attention, but they remain disputed and unsupported as firm explanations. The safer and more grounded view is that the carvings reflect a symbolic system whose meanings are not directly recoverable. They may include observations of the sky, seasons, animals, death, and group identity, but turning them into a precise astronomical message goes beyond the evidence. The animals also create atmosphere within the enclosures. Imagine entering a circular stone space where human-like pillars stand without faces and animal bodies move across the surrounding stones. The effect is not calm in the way later temple architecture can be calm. It is tense, watchful, alive with predators, scavengers, venomous creatures, and powerful wild bodies. Many of the animals are not domesticated, not softened, not controlled. They come from a world where humans are skilled but not separate, intelligent but vulnerable. The enclosures may have gathered that vulnerability and given it form. This is where Gobekli Tepe becomes more than an architectural puzzle. It is a record of relationship. Humans at the end of the Ice Age do not stand above the animal world as masters. They depend on it, fear it, follow it, eat it, imitate it, wear parts of it, perhaps identify with it, perhaps address unseen powers through it. The carvings preserve that entanglement. They show a mind that does not divide nature and culture as sharply as later modern thinking often does. Stone, animal, body, death, and gathering belong to the same field of meaning. Yet the animals remain silent. They offer clues without translation. A fox may be a fox, an ancestor sign, a group emblem, a trickster-like being, a spirit companion, or a marker of something seasonal. A snake may be danger, rebirth, underworld, water, lineage, or simply snake power in a sense no later language can recover. The evidence remains incomplete, and that uncertainty is not a failure. It is part of the honesty demanded by a site this old. What can be said is that the builders did not carve randomly. They chose animals that mattered, and they placed them in spaces that mattered. They surrounded human-like stones with non-human presences. They made a hilltop into a gathering place where the wild world was not excluded, but brought inward and fixed in limestone. The animals in the stone are not explanations of Gobekli Tepe. They are the mystery speaking in its own surviving language. Calling Gobekli Tepe a temple is both useful and dangerous. It is useful because the site clearly seems to be more than an ordinary cluster of houses, more than a hunting camp, more than a workshop where stone was shaped and then forgotten. The enclosures are formal, the pillars are symbolic, the animal carvings are deliberate, the spaces appear set apart, arranged to focus attention on central stones that may themselves represent powerful beings. Something about the hill asks to be understood as special, and temple is the familiar word people reach for when a place seems to gather the sacred into architecture. But the word is dangerous because it comes loaded with later history. A temple suggests gods with names, priests with roles, offerings with rules, worshippers with doctrines, perhaps even a boundary between religion and everyday life. Gobekli Tepe comes from a world before writing, before known states, before the religious institutions of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, or the Mediterranean. Its builders may not have separated the sacred from the practical in any way modern people would recognize. A feast could be ritual, a hunt could be social politics, a burial could be memory, belief, and inheritance at once. Scholars still debate the site's exact purpose because the categories are not simple enough. The strongest evidence for special ritual use lies in the architecture itself. The early circular and oval enclosures do not look like normal dwellings. They are too large, too formal, too dominated by pillars, and too heavily invested with imagery. Their benches and surrounding walls create contained spaces, while the central T-shaped pillars give the impression of presences placed at the heart of an event. The lack of obvious domestic features in the best-known monumental structures has long supported the idea that people gathered there for ceremonies rather than ordinary household life. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and newer research in the wider region reminds us that early Neolithic buildings can blur the line between communal, ritual, and domestic. A place can also change over time. Gobekli Tepe does not need to have one fixed identity across all its phases. The earliest monumental enclosures may have served one kind of purpose, while later smaller rectangular buildings may reflect different forms of use. Some areas may have been more public, others more practical. Some activities may have left little trace. This is one reason the site resists a single label. It may be less like a temple in the later institutional sense and more like a ritual landscape, a place where gatherings, memory, feasting, construction, death, and social negotiation overlapped. Feasting remains one of the most compelling clues. The deposits at the site contain large quantities of animal bones, many from wild species. These remains suggest repeated consumption on a scale that may exceed ordinary meals. If groups gathered seasonally or for special events, eating together could have been central to what made the place powerful. A communal meal can bind people to one another, display generosity, create debt, settle tensions, and transform labour into celebration. In that sense, food may be part of the ritual machinery. The stone circles may not have been silent sanctuaries. They may have been places of smoke, noise, work, butchery, storytelling, and controlled danger. There is also evidence of production. Flint tools, debris, and stoneworking traces show that practical tasks occurred around the site. This does not weaken the ritual interpretation. In many traditional societies, making sacred objects, preparing food, repairing structures, and performing ceremony all belong together. Modern distinctions between workshop, kitchen, shrine, and meeting hall may not apply. No single explanation fully accounts for Gobekli Tepe because the site may have been all of these things at once, depending on season, enclosure, and generation. The human-like pillars deepen the sense of something beyond utility. If the T-shaped stones represent stylized persons, then the enclosures may have been populated by beings rather than merely furnished with supports. The carved arms and hands on some pillars suggest bodies without faces, a strange anonymity that feels deliberate. These could be ancestors, mythic figures, ritual specialists, or entities belonging to a cosmology we cannot reconstruct. What survives in the record suggests that the builders created spaces where human and non-human powers met in stone. That is close to what many people mean by sacred, even if the builders would not have used any word like temple. Death may also be present, though not in the straightforward form of a cemetery. Human remains are rare and fragmentary, but modified skull fragments from Gobekli Tepe indicate that some human bones may have been treated in special ways. In the wider early Neolithic world, skull removal and curation are significant practices, often interpreted as forms of ancestor veneration or mortuary ritual. The connection to Gobekli Tepe's enclosures is debated, but it suggests that the hill may have been tied to relationships with the dead. If so, its power may have come not only from gods or spirits, but from remembered people whose presence remained socially active after death. Popular imagination often wants a sharper answer. Was it the world's first temple or not? The honest answer is slower. It may be one of the earliest known monumental ritual centers, and it may include structures that functioned in ways broadly comparable to temples. But calling it the first temple on Earth risks oversimplifying both the site and the word. Other early ritual places surely existed in wood, earth, cave, or open landscape and left fewer traces. Human sacred behavior is far older than stone architecture. Gobekli Tepe is not the beginning of belief. It is one of the earliest surviving moments when belief, gathering, and monumentality become archaeologically visible at this scale. That visibility is what changes the argument. Before Gobekli Tepe, it was easier to assume that organized religion in monumental form followed settled agriculture and social hierarchy. Here, the order becomes uncertain. The site suggests that ritual may have helped create the social conditions that later made farming communities more stable and complex. People may have gathered first, then needed more food. They may have built shared sacred places before they built permanent towns around fields. The temple, or something like it, may not have waited for civilization. It may have helped summon it. Still, mystery remains at the center. The enclosures could have hosted initiation rites, seasonal ceremonies, mortuary gatherings, mythic performances, alliance feasts, or events whose meaning combined all of these. The animal carvings might mark stories, groups, dangers, or powers. The central pillars might represent ancestors, divine beings, or idealized humans. The evidence can narrow possibilities, but it cannot restore the vanished words, gestures, songs, or silences that once filled the spaces. Archaeology gives the stage, the props, and traces of repeated action. The performance itself is gone. Perhaps the most grounded way to understand Gobekli Tepe is as a place where the ordinary world became intensified. Wild animals became symbols, stone became body, food became obligation, labour became memory. The hill became a centre not because it offered shelter or defence, but because people agreed, generation after generation, that something important happened there. That agreement may be the oldest architecture of all. Before walls are raised, a place must first be chosen in the mind. So Gobekli Tepe may be a temple, but it is also something stranger than the word allows. It is a gathering place before cities, a monument before kings, a symbolic landscape before writing, a social machine powered by belief and return. Its stones do not simply show that early people had religion. They show that religion, society, economy, art, and memory were already braided together in ways that later history would separate only imperfectly. The hill does not answer every question. It changes the shape of the question itself. At Gobekli Tepe, the act of burial may be as important as the act of building. The famous enclosures did not simply collapse in place, slowly abandoned to wind and weather. Many were deliberately filled, packed with limestone rubble, soil, flint tools, animal bones, and debris, until the pillars that once stood in open or enclosed space were sealed inside the hill. This is one reason they survived so well. The very act that hid them from the world protected them from it. But protection may not have been the builder's main concern. The question is why anyone would bury such a place at all. The answer is not obvious. A modern mind tends to imagine monuments as things meant to remain visible. A great structure is built to be seen, to impress, to proclaim memory across generations. Later civilizations carve royal names into stone precisely because they want the future to notice them. Gobekli Tepe offers a stranger possibility. A monument can be completed by being covered. A sacred space can have a life cycle. Its ending can be planned. To bury a building may not be to erase it, but to close it, contain it, return it to the earth, or transform its meaning. The fill inside the enclosures is not clean, empty soil. It contains material from human activity, bones of wild animals, fragments of tools, stones, and other debris. Some of this may have come from nearby occupation or ritual events. Some may have been gathered intentionally as part of the closing process. Scholars still debate how rapidly each enclosure was filled and what the fill represents. Was it a single major act of closure, a gradual accumulation, or repeated dumping over time? The evidence remains incomplete, and different enclosures may not share exactly the same history. But the result is clear: the structures were intentionally buried within the mound. This deliberate filling complicates every interpretation of the site. If the enclosures were sacred, why cover them? If they were abandoned, why invest effort in sealing them so thoroughly? If they were obsolete, why not simply leave them to decay? One possibility is that the buildings had ritual biographies. They were born through quarrying, shaping, raising, carving, and use. Then, at the end of their power or relevance, they were retired through burial. In many human societies, powerful objects cannot simply be thrown away. They must be decommissioned, hidden, broken, burned, or buried. Their danger or sanctity requires management. There may also have been rebuilding. Gobekli Tepe is not a single moment, and later structures differ from earlier ones. Filling an old enclosure could create ground for new activity above it. The hill grows through cycles of construction and burial, turning architecture into stratigraphy. Each generation inherits a place already heavy with earlier acts. They may know what lies beneath, or they may remember only that the hill is powerful because important things have been placed inside it. What survives in the record suggests that the mound is not accidental accumulation alone. It is a constructed memory. A lesser-known detail is that the fill preserved not only the architecture, but also traces of the social world around it. The bones inside the deposit speak of animals hunted, butchered, eaten, and discarded. The flint artifacts point to tool-making and use. The stones and rubble show the physical labour of closure. In this sense, the burial is not empty concealment. It is a dense archive of activities. The material packed around the pillars may include the remains of feasts or work carried out during the active life of the site. The monument is buried with fragments of the world that made it meaningful. There is a darker possibility as well. The burial may reflect changing beliefs. A structure that once held power may later become dangerous, outdated, or ritually exhausted. New groups may reinterpret old stones. New social arrangements may require old spaces to be closed. The shift from large circular enclosures to smaller rectangular structures suggests changing practices over time, though the exact meaning of that shift remains debated. Perhaps the earliest monumental forms belong to a way of gathering that later communities no longer needed, or no longer understood in the same way. The burial could mark continuity, but it could also mark rupture. What makes this especially haunting is that the builders could have left the pillars exposed, and then the site might have become famous in antiquity. Later farmers, herders, villagers, and empires might have seen them, reused them, feared them, or smashed them. Instead, the stones vanished beneath the hill. No later written tradition records their makers. No Mesopotamian scribe tells of an ancient sanctuary on a northern ridge. No classical traveller describes faceless T-shaped beings under the Anatolian sun. The burial removed Gobekli Tepe from visible history for almost 12,000 years. The act of covering may also connect to death, if the pillars are stylized persons, ancestors, or powerful beings. Then filling an enclosure could resemble burial of a social body. The space itself may have been treated like a body whose life had ended. The surrounding debris could be less like trash and more like grave fill, though this comparison must be made carefully. There is no simple evidence that each enclosure was a tomb, but in symbolic terms. Burial and architecture may have overlapped. Stone bodies stood inside a stone-built world, and eventually that world was covered by earth. The fill's animal bones intensify this possibility. If feasting accompanied closure, then the burial may have been a final communal act. People could gather, eat, work, remember, and seal the space together. A feast at the end of a monument's life would bind participants to the act of closure. It would turn abandonment into ceremony. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, but this combination of eating, debris, labour, and sealing suggests that the end of an enclosure was not casual. There is also a practical side. Buildings decay, walls weaken, new forms become desirable. A large enclosure may be difficult to maintain. Filling it could stabilize the mound and make room for later use, but purely practical explanations feel too small on their own. The effort required to bury these structures is significant. The fill is part of the site's history, not merely its afterthought. At Gobekli Tepe, practicality and ritual may once again be inseparable. The buried monument changes how time works at the hill. Each filled enclosure becomes invisible but still present. The surface hides the past while resting on it. Later builders may walk above earlier spaces, perhaps knowingly, perhaps not. The mound thickens with memory. This kind of layered place can be powerful precisely because it contains what cannot be seen. The unseen past becomes part of the hill's authority. A community does not need open ruins to remember that something lies beneath. When archaeologists finally remove the fill in the modern era, they reverse an ancient act. They open what others closed. That creates knowledge, but also a kind of disturbance. Stones that were sealed in darkness now face weather, cameras, and visitors. Conservation shelters rise where prehistoric coverings once lay. The site enters a new life. No longer a hidden ritual mound, but a global symbol of deep human antiquity. The burial that protected it is undone carefully, scientifically, but never neutrally. Every excavation changes the balance between preservation and revelation. The buried enclosures remind us that the past does not survive only because people wanted to speak to the future. Sometimes it survives because people tried to conceal, close, or transform it. Gobekli Tepe was not preserved by a message carved for us. It was preserved by an ending whose meaning we do not fully understand. That is humbling. The site's greatest gift may come from an act that was never meant for modern eyes. And so the hill becomes a paradox. It changes history because it disappeared. Its builders raised stones that challenge the origin story of civilization, then sealed them away so completely that the world forgot. Beneath the mound, the pillars waited in artificial darkness, surrounded by bones and broken tools, not ruined by abandonment but held inside a deliberate silence. The oldest temple on earth, or something stranger than a temple, did not merely stand. It was buried like a memory too powerful to leave exposed. For a long time, the standard story of the Neolithic sounded almost tidy. Human beings discovered or developed agriculture. Agriculture created food surplus. Surplus allowed people to settle in permanent villages. Villages grew more complex. Complexity produced temples, social hierarchy, and eventually civilization. It was a clean sequence, easy to teach and easy to remember. Food came first. Belief built in stone came later. Gobekli Tepe does not destroy that story completely, but it bends it until the old straight line no longer holds. The hill suggests a more unsettling possibility. People may have gathered for ritual before farming fully transformed their lives, and those gatherings may have helped push them toward more intensive food production. This does not mean that one day a group of hunter-gatherers decided to build a temple and accidentally invented agriculture. Real history is slower and messier than that. But it does mean that the relationship between farming and sacred architecture may run in both directions. Agriculture can support ritual centers, but ritual centers can also create demands that make agriculture more attractive, more necessary, or more likely to intensify. At Gobekli Tepe, the earliest monumental enclosures appear in a world still heavily dependent on wild resources. The animal bones point to hunting rather than herding. Wild gazelle, aurochs, boar, wild sheep, and birds dominate the remains. The people who gather there are not yet living in a fully domesticated landscape, yet they are organizing labor and perhaps large feasts. A feast requires reliable food at the right time. A gathering requires planning. If groups return repeatedly to the same hill for ceremonies, alliances, building, and memory, then the surrounding food world begins to matter in a new way. Wild abundance may be enough at first, but repeated large gatherings constrain even a generous landscape. This is where the old question reverses. Instead of asking only how farming made temples possible, one can ask whether places like Gobekli Tepe made farming desirable. If people needed grain for feasts, if they needed predictable food stores for workers, if they wanted to host groups from across the region, then the ability to manage plants would become socially powerful. Cultivation may begin not simply as a way to avoid hunger, but as a way to sponsor events, gain prestige, fulfill obligations, and support sacred gatherings. No single explanation fully accounts for the origins of agriculture, but Gobekli Tepe makes it difficult to ignore the role of ritual demand. The region itself strengthens the possibility. Southeastern Anatolia lies close to the natural habitats of several plants that later become central to farming, including wild forms of einkorn wheat. Genetic and archaeological research has long pointed to this broader zone as crucial in the domestication of key cereals. The people living here did not have to imagine grain from nothing. They already knew how to gather it, process it, and use it. Over generations, repeated harvesting, selective gathering, and perhaps deliberate sowing could slowly change human relationships with plants. Domestication is not a single invention. It is a long conversation between human behavior and plant evolution. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how directly Gobekli Tepe itself connects to early cultivation. The site is not a neat farming village with clear fields preserved around it. The earliest layers do not show simple proof that domesticated grain fed the builders, but nearby regions and contemporary or slightly later sites show the broader transformation taking place. The builders stand at the edge of this shift. They belong to a world in which wild resources are still central, but in which humans are beginning to alter the future of plants and animals in permanent ways. There is a surprising irony here. The first domesticated crops may not have been born only from calm practicality. They may have been tied to celebration, competition, obligation, and ritual excess. Grain can become bread, porridge, beer-like fermented drink, or ceremonial food. Meat from hunts can be consumed in dramatic public events. The desire to gather and display generosity can drive production beyond immediate household need. In later societies, feasts often become arenas of power, where leaders prove their worth by giving away food. It is possible that something similar, though not identical, was already happening in the Neolithic transition. This does not mean Gobekli Tepe was a brewery. Despite popular claims that early beer may have played a role at the site, large stone vessels and chemical possibilities have encouraged discussion of fermentation, and it is plausible that special drinks existed in Neolithic gatherings. But firm evidence remains debated. It is better to say that grain-based foods and perhaps fermented beverages may have been part of communal consumption, without turning that possibility into a certainty. The more important point is broader shared consumption can transform food from subsistence into social force. Farming also changes time. Hunter-gatherers are not careless wanderers, but agriculture demands new forms of commitment. Seeds are planted with future harvests in mind. Fields require return. Stored grain must be protected. Animals brought under human control alter movement, settlement, and responsibility. If ritual centers encourage people to return to the same places at the same seasons, they may prepare the mind and the social world for these commitments. A sacred hill can make repetition meaningful before a field makes it necessary. The relationship between settlement and ritual is equally complex. Permanent villages do not appear all at once fully formed. Some communities become semi-sedentary before agriculture. Some gather seasonally at special places. Some build communal structures within settlements. Gobekli Tepe belongs to a wider pattern in which architecture, ritual, and food production develop together unevenly. The site's importance lies not in proving that temples came before all farming everywhere, but in showing that monumental symbolic life could be a leading force, not merely an ornament added after economic change. This matters because it changes how civilization is imagined. If agriculture alone is treated as the engine, then human history looks like a story of calories becoming institutions. More food produces more people. More people produce hierarchy. Hierarchy produces monuments. There is truth in that. But Gobekli Tepe insists that meaning also moves history. People do not gather only because they are fed. Sometimes they find ways to feed themselves because they need to gather. They do not build only after surplus appears. Sometimes building helps create the social need for surplus. The old model also tends to separate practical and symbolic behavior, as if early humans first solved survival and only later turned to religion or art. Gobekli Tepe makes that separation look artificial. For the builders, carving animals, sharing meat, quarrying stone, remembering the dead, and returning to a hill may all have been part of one system. Food, belief, and cooperation were braided together from the start. What survives in the record suggests that the Neolithic was not just an economic revolution. It was a revolution in attention, obligation, and place. There were consequences. Once people begin living more closely with selected plants and animals, the human world changes irreversibly. Diets shift, work rhythms shift, disease patterns eventually shift. Property, inheritance, storage, and conflict take new forms. Settlement can bring security, but also crowding and inequality. Farming is not simply progress, it is a bargain with the future. Gobekli Tepe stands near the beginning of that bargain, before its costs and benefits are fully visible. Its builders may not have known that the habits forming around them would eventually lead to villages, towns, states, armies, taxation, and written law. They were not trying to invent civilization. They were trying to live meaningfully in their own changing world. That is why the site feels so important. It shows the Neolithic not as a cold technological upgrade, but as a deeply human transformation. Climate opens possibilities. Wild grains and animals provide resources. Communities gather. Ritual intensifies. Food demands grow. Experiments accumulate. The line between gathering wild grain and cultivating it slowly blurs. The line between seasonal meeting place and permanent center begins to blur as well. Out of such blurred edges, history changes direction. Farming after the sacred is not a slogan, but a possibility. It suggests that the first great monuments may not have waited for the first farmers to become rich enough. Instead, the monuments may have helped create the world in which farming made sense. At Gobekli Tepe, stone rises before the plough dominates. And in that reversal lies the site's quiet revolution. The oldest temple on earth does not merely sit at the beginning of agriculture. It asks whether human beings first changed the world because they had learned to harvest grain, or because they had already learned to gather around something they could not eat. Gobekli Tepe once looked almost alone, a strange hill standing outside the expected order of history. Its pillars seemed to rise from the edge of the known world as if no neighbouring tradition could explain them. But archaeology rarely leaves a miracle isolated for long. As research expands across southeastern Anatolia, the hill begins to look less like a single impossible exception and more like the most famous visible part of a much larger ritual landscape. The mystery does not shrink when neighbours appear. It grows wider. Across the region now often discussed under the name Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills, Several early Neolithic sites reveal related forms of architecture, imagery, and symbolic behavior. Karahan Tepe is especially important. Like Gobekli Tepe, it contains T-shaped pillars, carved stone, special buildings, and evidence of a complex communal world before the fully developed urban and agricultural systems of later history. Its discoveries make one thing clear. Gobekli Tepe was not an isolated flash of genius on a single mound. It belonged to a regional horizon of experimentation, gathering, and monumental meaning. Karahan Tepe adds its own strange details. Among its most remarkable finds is a special structure with carved human imagery and a cluster of phallic-looking stone elements rising from the floor, along with a sculpted human head emerging from stone. The effect is unsettling, bodily, and difficult to classify. It suggests that early Neolithic ritual life in this region did not focus only on animals or abstract pillars, but also on the human body in powerful and perhaps disturbing ways. Scholars still debate the exact meaning of these features, but they show that the symbolic world around Gobekli Tepe was not simple or uniform. Other nearby sites, including places such as Neveli Chori, Sebers, Sefer Tepe, and others in the wider region, contribute additional pieces. Some reveal communal buildings, some preserve carved figures or T-shaped stones, some show early village life intertwined with ritual architecture. Together, they suggest that communities in southeastern Anatolia were developing shared architectural languages and symbolic forms across a broad area. The T-shaped pillar may not have been the invention of one group alone. It may have belonged to a wider tradition, recognized by different communities who adapted it to their own places. This regional context changes the way Gobekli Tepe should be imagined. It was not a lonely temple visited by people with no other monumental reference points. It may have been one node in a network of hills, settlements, quarries, seasonal routes, and ceremonial centers. People could have moved between these places, carrying stories, marriage ties, craft knowledge, animal symbols, ritual obligations, and memories of older constructions. The landscape itself may have been mapped not by roads and borders, but by meaningful high places, springs, stone sources, burial zones, and gathering sites. A lesser-known but important detail is that some of these related sites show evidence for domestic life much more clearly than Gobekli Tepe's famous enclosures do. This matters because it complicates the sharp division between sanctuary and settlement. In the early Neolithic, ritual buildings can exist within villages, and village life can surround ritual spaces. The sacred is not always somewhere separate. It can stand at the center of daily life, or daily life can grow around places already considered powerful. What survives in the record suggests that the relationship between home, ceremony, and monument varied from site to site. Karahan Tepe also pushes the imagination beyond the word temple. Its carved spaces feel less like orderly halls of worship and more like environments of transformation. Human heads, bodies, animals, pillars, and subterranean feeling chambers appear together in ways that may relate to initiation, death, fertility, ancestor presence, or mythic performance. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, but the site makes it harder to reduce the whole region to a simple model of people building shrines before farms. Instead, these communities seem to be experimenting with how architecture could shape experience itself. The idea of a ritual landscape also helps explain labor. If multiple communities shared symbolic traditions, then large construction projects might have drawn support from networks rather than single villages. A group could contribute workers to one site at one time and receive participation elsewhere later, Knowledge of carving, quarrying, and building could circulate. Feasts could reinforce regional identity. The monuments may have helped create alliances across communities that were not yet bound by states or formal political institutions. In that sense, stone architecture may have been a tool for holding a scattered world together. The existence of neighbouring sites also warns against making Gobekli Tepe carry too much alone. For years, popular attention focused so intensely on the hill that it became almost mythic. The first temple, the birthplace of civilization, the single key to everything. The broader Tash Tepela landscape is more subtle and more interesting. It suggests a whole cultural field in motion. Different communities are trying related solutions to shared problems: how to gather, how to remember, how to represent dangerous animals and powerful bodies, how to organize labor, how to live with the dead, how to become more settled without losing older ways of movement and identity. This does not mean the sites were identical. Each place has its own character. Gobekli Tepe is famous for its circular enclosures and animal reliefs. Karahan Tepe brings more explicit bodily imagery. Navali Chori, now submerged beneath dam waters after excavation, showed T-shaped pillars within a settlement context, reminding us that some of the evidence for this world has already been altered or lost by modern development. The early Neolithic record is fragile. What survives is partly an accident of preservation, excavation, and timing. The wider landscape also highlights how much remains unknown. Many sites are only partly excavated. Some are known through survey, surface finds, or limited trenches. Entire hills may still hide architecture beneath soil. Conservation concerns slow excavation, as they should. Every new discovery may change the balance of interpretation. The evidence remains incomplete, and the story of Gobekli Tepe's neighbours is still being written in stone dust, trenches, and cautious reports. Yet the pattern is already clear enough to matter. Around 11,000 years ago, southeastern Anatolia was not a passive backdrop to the invention of farming. It was a creative centre of symbolic architecture. Communities here were building with stone, gathering in special places, carving animals and bodies, and forming social worlds that challenge old assumptions about what hunter-gatherer or early farming societies could do. The region was not waiting for civilization to arrive from somewhere else. It was actively generating new possibilities. Seen this way, Gobekli Tepe becomes both less alone and more powerful. Its importance does not depend on being unique. In fact, it becomes more historically meaningful because it belongs to a network. A single strange site can be dismissed as an anomaly. A landscape of related sites points to a cultural transformation. It suggests that the oldest temple on Earth, or something stranger than a temple, was part of a broader human awakening to place, stone, and shared symbolic power. The hill still holds its silence, but now that silence has echoes. Across nearby ridges and buried mounds, other stones answer it. Together they reveal a region where people before cities were already building centres, marking bodies, carving animals, and making architecture out of belief. Gobekli Tepe changes everything, not because it stands alone in the dark, but because it shows that beneath the first light of the Neolithic, an entire landscape was beginning to speak. The human body at Gobekli Tepe is everywhere and almost nowhere. It is suggested in the pillars, hinted at in carved arms and hands, broken into fragments of skull, and displaced into animals that may stand beside humans, replace them, threaten them, or carry them beyond death. Unlike later civilizations, this world does not give us statues with names beneath them, or tomb walls covered in scenes of rulers and servants. It gives us bodies reduced to signs a hand on stone. a belt across a faceless torso, a headless figure, a skull marked by tools. The result is more unsettling than a portrait. It feels like humanity stripped down to presence. The T-shaped pillars are central to this bodily mystery. For a long time, it was possible to see them simply as abstract megaliths, shaped stones with broad tops and vertical shafts. But several pillars make the human reference difficult to ignore. Carved arms run down their sides. Hands rest near the front. Belts and loincloth-like forms appear at the lower body. These are not ordinary architectural supports. They are bodies turned into stone, but bodies without faces, without feet, without individuality. If they represent people, they represent them in a way that removes everything personal except posture and power. This absence of faces matters. A face invites recognition. A faceless body suggests something broader an ancestor category. A spirit being, an idealized person, a ritual role, or a presence that should not be reduced to one individual. Scholars still debate what these pillars meant, and the evidence remains incomplete. But their anthropomorphic features imply that the enclosures may have been filled not merely with symbols, but with beings. To stand inside one of those spaces may have been to stand among stone bodies, watched by nothing with eyes, surrounded by animals that seem more visually alive than the human forms themselves. That contrast is strange. The animals often have movement and detail. The humans, if humans they are, have silence and restraint. Perhaps this is because the human-like pillars represent something too powerful for ordinary depiction. Perhaps faces were painted and have not survived. Perhaps the T-form itself carried a meaning that did not need facial features. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the visual grammar is clear enough. Human presence is monumental, vertical, central, and controlled. Animal presence is active, dangerous, and mobile. The two worlds meet in the same architecture. Human remains add another layer. At Gobekli Tepe, researchers have identified fragments of human skulls bearing cut marks and modifications, including grooves that may have been made deliberately. These remains are not abundant enough to define the site as a cemetery, but they are too important to ignore. They suggest that parts of human bodies, especially heads, may have been treated in special ways. In the broader pre-pottery Neolithic world, skull practices are well known. Skulls could be removed, curated, plastered, displayed, or otherwise transformed after death. The head seems to have carried a social and symbolic importance that outlasted the body. Ancestor veneration is one possible explanation, though it must be used carefully. Later and ethnographic parallels show that keeping skulls or modifying heads can maintain relationships with the dead, mark lineage, claim place, or preserve the presence of important persons. But Gobekli Tepe's skull fragments do not come with labels explaining whether they belong to revered ancestors, enemies, ritual specialists, or anonymous dead. What survives in the record suggests special treatment, not a complete belief system. Still, the focus on skulls fits a world where the dead remain socially active. Death in early Neolithic Southwest Asia is often close to architecture. In some settlements, people are buried beneath house floors, skulls are removed after decomposition. Bodies and buildings become linked through repeated acts of burial, retrieval, and memory. A house can become a container of ancestors. A communal building can become a stage for relations between living and dead. Gobekli Tepe's monumental enclosures may belong to this wider concern, even if they are not houses and not tombs in any simple sense. The dead may have been present there through fragments, images, stories, or rituals that left only indirect traces. The animal carvings return here with new force, Vultures, if correctly identified in some images, may point toward the treatment of bodies after death. In some interpretations of Neolithic imagery, vultures are associated with excarnation, the exposure of corpses so that birds remove flesh. This practice is known in various cultures around the world, though direct evidence at Gobekli Tepe remains debated. It is possible that birds, skulls, and faceless pillars all belong to a symbolic field concerned with transformation. The body decays, the head remains, the ancestor persists, the stone body stands. There are also more disturbing images in the wider region. At nearby early Neolithic sites, carved scenes include human figures in tense relationships with animals, and at Karahan Tepe, the human head emerging from stone creates an almost subterranean bodily presence. These are not gentle images of agricultural fertility in the later familiar sense. They feel raw, transitional, and charged with the vulnerability of bodies. The early Neolithic imagination seems deeply concerned with what a human being is: body, head, ancestor, animal, stone, memory, or some unstable combination of all of these. A lesser-known detail is that some pillars show hands positioned near the front of the body in a restrained pose, almost formal, while the animals around them may twist or lunge. The hands are carefully placed but not active. They do not hold tools or weapons. They do not gesture dramatically. They simply rest, as if the stone being is present in a state of authority rather than action. This quiet posture may be part of the power of the pillars. They do not need to move. Everything else moves around them. The possibility of ancestor presence also connects to placemaking. In mobile or semi-mobile societies, anchoring memory can be difficult. People move through landscapes, but the dead create claims. A hill associated with powerful ancestors, skull rituals, or stone bodies could become a point of return across generations. It could hold identity in a world not yet organized by cities, written genealogies, or permanent political borders. To gather at Gobekli Tepe may have been to gather not only with the living, but under the authority of those who came before, whether imagined as human ancestors, mythic beings, or something between. This does not mean the site was peaceful or harmonious. Ancestors can unite, but they can also define exclusion. Ritual can bind groups, but it can also create hierarchy, obligation, and fear. The control of skulls, ceremonies, or special knowledge may have given certain people influence. The ability to speak for the dead is never a small power. Scholars still debate how inequality developed in these early communities, but Gobekli Tepe shows that symbolic authority existed before states. Whether that authority was shared, contested, temporary, or concentrated remains one of the open questions. The human body at the site therefore becomes a clue to the birth of social complexity. Bodies are carved into pillars, heads are modified after death, animals surround human forms, buildings are buried like bodies. The living gather inside spaces populated by presences that may represent the more than living. This is not civilization in the later urban sense, but it is already a deeply organized moral and symbolic world. People are not merely surviving in a landscape. They are negotiating what it means to be human within time, death, and memory. What makes Gobekli Tepe so haunting is that it refuses to show us the human face. The builders carved animals with energy and recognition, but the central human-like stones remain blank. Perhaps that blankness is accidental, or perhaps it is the point. The people who made the site may not have wanted individuals. They may have wanted presences larger than individuals, bodies that outlasted flesh, ancestors without biography, beings whose power came from not being reduced to a single human life. in that facelessness. The site becomes strangely universal. The builders are gone, their languages gone, their gestures gone, their stories gone, but their concern with bodies, death, memory, and belonging remains familiar across the abyss of time. At Gobekli Tepe, the human figure stands without a face because the face has vanished from history. Yet the hands are still there, carved into stone, resting at the edge of the body, as if holding in place the oldest relationship humans ever had to confront the living reaching toward the dead, and the dead becoming part of the landscape. Before writing, history lives in bodies, places, objects, and repetition. It is carried by people who remember where to gather, which animals matter, which stones are dangerous or sacred, which dead must not be forgotten, which gestures belong to a ceremony, and which stories should be told when the season turns. Gobekli Tepe belongs to that world before text, a world not without knowledge, but without the kind of knowledge that can be pinned to a tablet and read 10,000 years later. The builders may have had myths as rich as any later civilization, but if they did, those myths passed through breath, performance, image, and ritual. The words are gone. This is one of the deepest frustrations of the site. The stones clearly say that meaning was present, but they do not translate it. Later ancient temples often come with inscriptions, god names, offering lists, royal boasts, foundation deposits, and myths preserved in fragments. Gobekli Tepe gives no such help. There is no written sign beside a fox explaining why it matters. No carved line identifies the central pillars. No surviving chant tells us what happened when people entered the enclosures. Archaeology can reconstruct contexts, not resurrect voices. The evidence remains incomplete, and the silence is permanent in ways that no discovery may fully repair. Yet a world without writing is not a world without stories. In fact, oral societies can preserve astonishingly complex bodies of knowledge. Stories can encode migration routes, animal behavior, kinship rules, seasonal calendars, moral lessons, cosmology, and memories of disaster. They are not casual entertainment alone. They are social technology. A myth can tell people where they belong, whom they may marry, why a ritual must be performed, why a certain animal must be feared, or why a hill is different from other hills. At Gobekli Tepe, the carvings may have worked with spoken traditions now lost, serving as anchors for stories performed in the presence of stone. The animal reliefs are especially suggestive in this regard. A cluster of snakes may have called forth a story everyone present knew. A fox may have marked a lineage, a trickster-like being, a dangerous helper, or an event from a mythic past. A vulture may have belonged to a tale of death and transformation. The carvings are not random, but they may be incomplete by design. They may not be meant to explain themselves to strangers. They may be prompts for memory, signs whose full meaning existed only when activated by people, voices, movement, and shared knowledge. What survives in the record suggests a symbolic system, but not its grammar. This is why modern attempts to decode Gobekli Tepe often say more about modern desire than ancient truth. Some have tried to read the pillars as star charts, records of comet impacts, calendars, or messages from a lost advanced civilization. A few claims are imaginative and attract attention because the site is old enough to invite cosmic drama, but most such interpretations go far beyond the evidence. The carvings may well have included celestial associations. Many ancient and traditional societies connect animals, seasons, and sky patterns, but turning the reliefs into a precise astronomical document is not supported with the certainty often claimed. scholars still debate these ideas, and the cautious view remains that the imagery reflects ritual and symbolic worlds we cannot fully decode. The absence of writing also changes how time itself is held. Later civilizations can archive memory externally. They can store lore, trade, genealogy, praise, and myth on clay, papyrus, stone, or parchment. At Gobekli Tepe, memory must be renewed through use. If a story stops being told, it vanishes. If a ceremony stops being performed, its meaning thins. If people stop returning to the hill, the stones remain, but their living world fades. This may be one reason repetition matters so much. Returning to a place is a way of keeping it alive. The site's buried enclosures may have been part of this memory system. A structure could be raised, used, closed, and covered, becoming an invisible layer beneath later activity. Such burial may have preserved not only architecture, but remembered time. People walking above a filled enclosure may have known, or believed, that powerful things lay below. The hill becomes a container of stories, each generation adding another layer. In a non-literate world, landscape can become archive. A mound is not just soil, it is accumulated memory. One lesser-known but important possibility is that some symbols at Gobekli Tepe and related sites may have functioned as shared signs across communities without being writing. They could mark group identity, ritual roles, or mythic themes, much as heraldic symbols or clan animals do in later societies. This is not writing because it does not record language line by line, but it is still communication. It can say who belongs, what powers are present, what kind of event is taking place, or which relationships matter. The path from symbol to script is long and uneven, and Gobekli Tepe stands far before the invention of writing. But it shows that humans were already building dense visual systems. The myths behind the stones may also have explained origins. Many societies tell stories about how people first came to be, why animals behave as they do, why death exists, why the sky is ordered, why certain places are forbidden or sacred, and why ancestors must be honoured. Gobekli Tepe appears at a time of enormous transformation as climate shifts, food systems change, and communities begin to gather in new ways. Myths may have helped make sense of that instability. They may have connected new practices to ancient authority, turning innovation into tradition. A newly built enclosure can feel old if the story attached to it begins in mythic time. That matters because major social change is easier to accept when framed as continuity. If people are being asked to gather more often, work harder, contribute food, follow ritual leaders, or return to a specific hill, stories can explain why this must be done. They can make social obligations feel cosmic. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of Gobekli Tepe, but symbolic narratives may have helped transform practical cooperation into sacred duty. The builders did not need writing to create powerful institutions of memory. They needed shared belief, repeated performance, and places where belief could be made visible. At the same time, not every symbol has to be solemn. Ancient ritual worlds often include humour, fear, inversion, masks, danger, and ambiguity. The modern tendency is to make prehistoric religion either grand and noble or dark and terrifying. It may have been both, and also ordinary in ways we would not expect. People may have laughed at feasts, argued over obligations, admired skilled carvers, feared certain ceremonies, and brought children to gatherings where the meaning unfolded slowly across a lifetime. The sacred is not always quiet. Sometimes it smells of smoke, sweat, blood, dust, and cooked meat. Because there is no writing, The temptation is to fill the silence too completely, but restraint gives Gobekli Tepe more power, not less. It is enough to know that people were making images, building spaces, and returning to them over generations. It is enough to see that animals, bodies, death, and place were woven together. The exact myths are gone, but the need for myth is visible. The stones are the fossil of a story system. This is where Gobekli Tepe changes the meaning of prehistory. Prehistory does not mean before thought, before memory, or before complex explanation. It means before written records survive. The people of Gobekli Tepe may have known their world through narratives as elaborate as those of later civilizations, but archaeology catches only the hard edges: the carved animal, the pillar, the skull fragment, the buried wall. The soft parts, the spoken parts, have dissolved. And yet something remains. A myth without writing can still alter stone. It can organize labor, choose a hill, guide a hand, decide which animal deserves to be carved, and determine when a sacred space must be buried. The stories of Gobekli Tepe are lost, but their consequences still stand. That may be the strangest survival of all, not the myth itself, but the fact that people believed it strongly enough to reshape the earth. Gobekli Tepe matters because it unsettles the word origin. Origins are usually told as clean beginnings, as if civilization starts when one decisive invention arrives and everything else follows. Farming begins and villages appear. Villages grow and temples rise. Temples accumulate power and cities form. Cities produce writing, kings, armies, law, and history. The sequence is comforting because it gives the human past the shape of a staircase. Each step leads upward. Each stage explains the next. But the hill in southeastern Anatolia interrupts that easy climb. It shows that some of the forces associated with civilization were already active before civilization, at least in the familiar urban sense, had fully arrived. The problem is not that archaeology had everything wrong. Agriculture really did transform human life. Permanent settlements really did create new possibilities for population growth, storage, craft specialization, social ranking, and political authority. Cities did become engines of law, trade, violence, administration, and memory. But Gobekli Tepe reveals that the roots of complexity reach into older ground. Before tax collectors, there were obligations. Before kings, there were forms of authority. Before written myths, there were powerful stories. Before cities, there were central places. Before domesticated herds and fields dominated the landscape, people were already gathering around stone embodiments of meaning. This changes how cooperation is understood. Large-scale human cooperation is sometimes explained through practical necessity. People work together because irrigation must be managed, grain must be stored, walls must be defended, or rulers must command labor. Gobekli Tepe suggests that cooperation can also crystallize around shared symbolic worlds. People can work together because a place matters, because ancestors matter, because a ceremony must be completed, because feasting creates debt, because prestige is at stake, because the invisible order of the world seems to depend on action. No single explanation fully accounts for such cooperation, but the site proves that monumental shared labor does not require a city bureaucracy to begin. It also complicates the birth of inequality. The old assumption might be that relatively simple hunter-gatherer bands lived in broad equality until agriculture produced surplus, and surplus produced elites. There is truth in the idea that farming can intensify inequality, especially when land stored food, and inheritance become central. But societies before farming are not automatically simple or equal in every respect. Some hunter-gatherer communities, especially those with rich resources and seasonal aggregation, develop status differences, ritual specialists, competitive feasting, and inherited privileges. Gobekli Tepe does not show a king, but it may show the conditions from which more formal hierarchy could eventually emerge. Someone knows how to organize the quarrying, someone understands the plan, someone decides which animals appear and where, someone remembers when an enclosure must be closed. These roles may not belong to permanent rulers. They may shift, overlap, or depend on ritual knowledge rather than force. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to imagine a fully formed priestly class standing behind every pillar. Still, the monument suggests that certain kinds of knowledge carried power. In a world where meaning organizes labor, those who manage meaning matter. The site also forces a reconsideration of religion's place in early society. Religion is sometimes treated as a later institution, something that grows once food is secure and life becomes settled enough for elaborate ceremony. Gobekli Tepe points in another direction. Symbolic systems may help create settlement, not merely decorate it. Ritual may provide the framework through which scattered groups build trust. Shared sacred places may reduce conflict or, just as likely, channel conflict into controlled competition. They may turn strangers into allies or rivals into participants in the same order. Belief is not separate from survival. It can be a survival strategy, though not always a gentle one. There is a surprising modern lesson in this. Human beings often describe themselves as rational animals who build institutions to solve material problems. But the deep past suggests something broader. People build around stories. They endure hardship for symbols. They create economies around obligations that are emotional, moral, ancestral, or sacred. A granary can feed a village, but a myth can tell the village why the grain must be stored, who may distribute it, and what happens if the rules are broken. The practical and the symbolic are not rivals. They grow together. Gobekli Tepe also changes the meaning of monumentality. A monument is not just a large object. It is a social act made durable. It concentrates labor into a visible form and then asks future people to respond to it. At later sites, monuments often glorify rulers, commemorate victories, or declare ownership. At Gobekli Tepe, the message is harder to read. There are no royal faces, no battle scenes, no inscriptions of conquest. The monumentality seems directed toward beings, animals, ancestors, or powers outside ordinary biography. This may represent an earlier kind of authority, one rooted less in individual rulers than in shared cosmology. The absence of writing is essential. Writing allows authority to become portable and precise. It records debts, laws, names, borders, and offerings. Without writing, authority depends more heavily on performance, memory, repetition, and place. Gobekli Tepe may be a monument to that kind of authority, not bureaucratic, but embodied, not textual, but spatial. People know what the hill means because they have been brought there, fed there, instructed there, frightened there, initiated there, or told stories there. When writing later appears in human history, it does not invent power. It gives new tools to powers already ancient. The problem of origins also extends to civilization itself. The word civilization is often used as if it means cities, writing, government, and monumental architecture together. Gobekli Tepe separates those elements. It has monumentality without cities. It has symbolic architecture without writing. It has organized labor without visible state administration. It has social complexity before the full agricultural package is firmly in place. This does not make it a civilization in the conventional sense, but it shows that civilization is assembled from parts that can appear in different orders. The staircase becomes a braided river. That image is closer to the archaeological reality. Human history does not move in one line. Different regions develop different combinations of settlement, farming, ritual, technology, inequality, and political organization. Some experiments fail. Some vanish. Some are absorbed into later ways of life. Some leave no stone behind. Gobekli Tepe survives because limestone endured and because the enclosures were buried. It may represent only one visible peak of a much wider range of early experiments, many of which remain undiscovered or lost forever. This is why the site has attracted both serious scholarship and wild speculation. It sits at a point where the known story becomes unstable, and instability invites imagination. Fringe theories try to fill the gap with lost super-civilizations, visitors from the stars, or survivors of forgotten catastrophes. These ideas are disputed and unsupported, and they are less interesting than the real evidence. The true shock of Gobekli Tepe is not that impossible outsiders must have built it. The shock is that ordinary ancient humans, with stone tools, memory, skill, and shared belief, were capable of more than modern assumptions allowed. In that sense, the site restores dignity to deep prehistory. It does not make the builders mysterious because they were alien to humanity. It makes them mysterious because they were profoundly human in ways that still matter. They organized around meaning. They transformed landscape into memory. They gave form to fear and reverence. They created obligations strong enough to move stone. They stood at the threshold of farming, settlement, and later civilization. But they were not simply stepping toward us. They were living inside their own world, complete and urgent. The origin of civilization, then, is not a single invention. It is a convergence of hunger and imagination, climate and memory, plants and animals, bodies and stones, cooperation and competition, death and return. Gobekli Tepe changes the question from what came first to what forces had to come together. Farming matters. So does ritual. So does landscape. So does the human need to make invisible relationships visible. The hill does not replace one simple origin story with another. It teaches that simple origin stories are not enough. And perhaps that is why the faceless pillars still feel so powerful. They stand before the age of named rulers and written histories, before civilization learns to explain itself in its own words. They belong to a time when human beings are beginning to anchor large social worlds in particular places, but have not yet built the machinery that will later dominate the ancient Near East. Gobekli Tepe is not the first city, not the first farm, not the first religion, not the first art. It is something rarer, a surviving intersection where many beginnings meet, none of them complete, all of them changing the future. Much of Gobekli Tepe still sleeps underground. That is one of the most important things to remember, because the famous images can make the site feel already known. The great T-shaped pillars, the carved foxes and snakes, the circular enclosures, the hilltop under its protective shelter. But what has been excavated is only part of a larger mound, and the mound itself is only part of a wider landscape of related sites. The story is not finished. It is still under soil, still locked in stone, still waiting inside layers that archaeologists approach with patience, because discovery is also destruction if it is done carelessly. Modern survey has revealed that the buried hill contains more than the first spectacular enclosures that made Gobekli Tepe famous. Subsurface investigations suggest additional structures, features, and phases remain hidden. Some may resemble what has already been found. Others may complicate everything. That is the unsettling promise of the site. Every trench can confirm a pattern or break it. Every newly exposed pillar can shift the balance between temple, gathering place, settlement, mortuary landscape, and social centre. The evidence remains incomplete not because archaeologists have failed, but because the past is large and excavation must be slow. Conservation now shapes the future of the site as much as excavation does. For nearly 12,000 years, many of the stones survived because they were buried. Once exposed, they enter a harsher world of temperature changes, moisture, sunlight, human breath, tourism, and vibration. The protective shelter that now covers the main excavated area is a modern answer to an ancient problem: how to keep the stones from vanishing after they have finally returned to view. It is an irony worthy of the place. To understand Gobekli Tepe, people must uncover it. To preserve it, they must learn not to uncover too much too quickly. Tourism brings another tension. The site is no longer only an archaeological mound. It is a global destination, a symbol of deep history, and a source of local and national pride. Visitors come because they want to stand near the beginning of something, even if that beginning is harder to define than the brochures suggest. Their attention helps keep the site visible and valued, but it also risks simplifying it into a slogan: the world's first temple, the birthplace of civilization, the place that changed everything. Those phrases are not entirely wrong, but they are too small unless held carefully. Gobekli Tepe changes everything by making easy stories more difficult. What still sleeps underground may answer some questions and sharpen others. Future work may clarify how many people lived near the hill, how the enclosures were roofed or left open, how construction phases relate to one another, how food was organized, how the site connects to neighboring places, and whether different parts serve different groups or functions. More evidence may refine the dating. More botanical remains may illuminate the role of wild or cultivated plants. More human remains, if found and studied ethically, may deepen the connection to skull practices and mortuary ritual. More carvings may reveal patterns that are currently invisible, but no discovery is likely to give back the lost language, the spoken myths, or the exact emotions of those who gathered there. That limit is not a weakness. It is part of the truth of archaeology. The past does not return whole, it returns as pattern, damage, context, and surprise. Gobekli Tepe gives enough to transform understanding, but not enough to end wonder. It shows that early Neolithic people could organize monumental labor before cities. It shows that symbolic architecture could emerge before farming fully dominated life. It shows that animals, bodies, death, food, and stone were bound together in a powerful ritual landscape. It also refuses to say precisely what the builders believed. Scholars still debate the details, and they should. A mystery this old deserves caution as much as imagination. The site's legacy reaches beyond archaeology because it changes the way human beginnings are imagined. It pulls the roots of cooperation deeper into prehistory. It reminds us that people did not become fully human only when they built cities or wrote laws. They were already capable of shared abstraction, long labor, symbolic worlds, and social obligations strong enough to reshape a hill. The builders of Gobekli Tepe were not rehearsing for civilization as later people define it. They were living in a world of their own, with its own urgencies, dangers, and meanings. Yet the consequences of such worlds eventually fed into the long transformation that made villages, farming, and cities possible. There is also a lesson in humility. For centuries, modern people underestimated those who lived before agriculture, imagining them as trapped in survival, too busy with hunger to make monuments, too scattered to build, too simple to sustain large symbolic systems. Gobekli Tepe corrects that view without replacing it with fantasy. The builders did not need metal, wheels, writing, or alien visitors. They needed stone, skill, memory, food, social pressure, and belief. Those are human tools, and they are powerful enough. The hill remains unfinished in the modern imagination because it is unfinished in the ground. Beneath the surface, there may be more pillars with animals no one has seen in millennia, more structures filled by hands whose motives remain unknown, more traces of feasts, tools, skulls, closures, and rebuilding. Some answers are still buried, some may never survive, some may already have been destroyed by time, erosion, later activity, or the limits of preservation. What survives in the record is extraordinary, but it is not everything. That incompleteness is what keeps Gobekli Tepe alive. It is not a solved monument placed neatly at the start of a timeline. It is a pressure point in history, a place where assumptions buckle. The oldest temple on Earth, or something stranger than a temple, does not hand us a finished origin story. It leaves us with a hill full of buried architecture and a harder, richer understanding of the human past. Long before cities learned to write their names, people were already gathering beneath open skies, carving animals into stone, raising faceless bodies from limestone, feeding one another, burying their monuments, and making places that could outlive memory itself. Time softens even the hardest stone. The hands that cut Gobekli Tepe are gone, and so are the voices that once gave the hill its meaning. The people who gathered there did not know they were standing at the edge of what later ages would call civilization. They did not know that their buried enclosures would one day be measured against pyramids, cities, temples, and empires not yet dreamed into existence. They lived inside their own present, under their own sky, with hunger, memory, fear, obligation, and wonder pressing close around them. That may be the quietest truth of Gobekli Tepe. It is not important because it gives the modern world a perfect beginning. It is important because it shows that beginnings are rarely perfect. They are layered, uncertain, and human. They happen when people return to a place often enough for the place to become more than land. They happen when animals become symbols, when the dead remain near, when food becomes ceremony, when labor becomes devotion, when a hill begins to hold a community's imagination. The pillars still stand, but they stand without explanation. Their faces, if they ever had faces, are absent. Their stories are gone. Around them move carved creatures from a world still wild enough to frighten and feed the people who watched it. Snakes slide through stone. Foxes keep their narrow silence. Birds wait at the edge of a death and sky. The human forms remain upright, calm, and blank, as if they are not looking at us, but past us, towards something older than memory. In the end, Gobekli Tepe does not reduce the mystery of civilization. It deepens it. It reminds us that before written history, before kings, before walls and armies and accounts, human beings were already reaching beyond the immediate day. They were already making places where time could gather. They were already trying to hold the invisible still long enough for others to feel it. And somewhere beneath the Anatolian sun, under a hill that once looked ordinary, that effort survived, buried in darkness, wrapped in rubble, waiting through the rise and fall of everything that came after. The stones kept their silence. They still keep it now. But in that silence, they leave one final image, a circle of pillars on a windswept hill, older than the oldest stories we can read, standing at the edge of the human beginning.